What's going on, folks? It's Mr. Majewski. I am coming at you with the first half of the industrial geography, kind of what you need to know questions. We're going to go through those. We're going to answer each of those as quickly as we can. There's actually a second half to this that I already did. For some reason, I don't have the first half video. I think I did that in person. So anyways, this is the first half. I'll put them together so you get both the first and the second half of these questions together. My exam's only going to have 15 to 20 multiple choice. We already covered development earlier in the year, so I'm only picking and choosing about 20 questions from this half of Unit 7 for AP Human Geography. Okay, so let's get right into it. We're going to go line by line like we always do. I will be referring to a presentation, a slides presentation at various points just to reinforce what I am saying. Any questions that are not answered fully or that you have further questions about, you can always leave in the comments. You can always ask me in class, obviously, if you're one of my students. Okay, let's go. Like I said, industry is an important part of Unit 7, but it is only about half of it. I would say, based on the new CED, it's actually a little less than half of this particular unit. Okay, what is industry and what was the Industrial Revolution? Well, industry, right, is the development of manufacturing or manufactured goods. It's when a country is in a position where they are taking raw materials and they are converting those into finished products or manufactured goods. Industrialization involves the switch from human to animal to machine power. And so what you are going to see is mechanization, right? Of course, that means the use of machines for mass production. This will be the first time you really start to see those in wide numbers. All right, you're also going to start to see urbanization, the movement to cities as industrialization happens. And these processes are going to get larger. They're going to happen in even larger numbers as industrialization continues and the country becomes more industrialized. All right. Of course, you're going to see changes to agriculture as well as agriculture becomes more based on mass production. So all of these things are kind of happening together. It doesn't happen instantaneously. It usually takes a long period of time for this transition to occur in a place. Decades, right? In the United States, industrialization took a very long time for it to occur. Many decades, right? Some historians would say it took 70, 80 years. Others, right, claim it takes even longer than that. Where did industrial revolution? Oh, so an industrial revolution is when industry emerges, right? When industrialization starts to happen in a place for the first time. And it's usually like a wave that hits the country. Maybe in a few industries to start, but eventually industrialization is occurring across almost all or all industries within that place. Where did it begin? Well, it began in England, and then it spread obviously throughout the British Isles. It eventually spread into continental Europe, France, Belgium, the Netherlands. Eventually, it is moved into North America as well, especially the United States when it does emerge. You also start to see it emerge in places like Japan later on as well. Industrialization was really a European and North American thing, again, with the exception of Japan and Australia, New Zealand, right? It was exported by some countries to some of their colonies, like with the United States, originally British colonies. Okay? When? That's a tough one. Usually it's 1600s, 1700s, even into the 1800s. You really start to see these changes occur. At first it was in agriculture, and then eventually it merged into other industries that existed. What were cottage industries? Cottage industries were how things were made before industrialization. So cottage industry means that people are making, cottage is another word for a home at the time, right? Like a house. So people would make things by hand prior to industrialization. And you usually were skilled at making that thing. But there weren't a lot of you. It took time to become skilled to make these things by hand. And so cottage industries were how things were manufactured previously to before industrialization takes place. What happens to the cottage industry after revolution? Usually it goes away. Why? Well, because we can mass produce those products now. And we can also produce them in a way where they may not be at the same level of quality, but they're at a level of quality where the price is going to come way down because of our mass production, and it's going to be a really high level. And so cottage industries couldn't compete with that. And so these skilled craftsmen oftentimes were really wiped out by industrialization. And they were no longer really skilled, right? Because machines operated by quote unquote unskilled laborers could now do that job as well. All right, let's get into question number 2 here. What industries most benefited from the Industrial Revolution? And what inventions were most instrumental in helping them to industrialize? We're not going to spend a ton of time on this one, but I want to draw your attention back to a presentation that we had previously looked at, right? And by the way, if you wanted to revisit the cottage industry question and the start of the Industrial Revolution, it was actually the first slide in that presentation. All right, let's go to the industries that were most affected. Well, yes, iron obviously is one of them. Iron is a major trigger for industrialization, I think you could say. Iron allows basically the construction of machines, it allows the construction of buildings, it allows the construction of infrastructure like bridges and railroads, railroad track, that could carry heavier loads than ever before. And so iron was really one of the industries that really exploded as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Coal as well. Maybe coal one of the most important, right? Because coal is what we're using for energy in order to create the iron and eventually to create the steel. It's also powering machines that we are using here that are mass producing for the first time in England and eventually the rest of Europe. Textiles, clothing, is actually the first industry that is known for having industrialized. So after you start to see coal begin to be churned out, after we start to see iron be produced, it was actually textiles, clothing, where you saw industrialization happen first in England. Also in the United States, that was the industry where you saw it first as well. And so we saw the mechanization, the machines in the textile industry. We saw mass production, and that meant prices come way down, right? And a need for a ton of laborers in these new clothing textile factories. Transportation, another huge industry affected by the revolution, right? Obviously, railroads are considered a major cause of the revolution, and right, they're the vehicle that facilitates, that helps to expand the revolution the most, because obviously we're going to have steam and coal powered rail. It's going to be carrying huge amounts of these precious resources to these factories and other plants, right? And of course, the engines, the rails themselves are made out of iron and eventually steel as well. Chemical industry, textile, bleaches for different colors of clothing, dyes were developed, chemicals that allowed for the preservation of food. That's a major change as well. We even start to see the emergence of some chemical fertilizers already, and other methods for increased production as well. Preservatives, a lot of preservatives, right, that allowed food and other products to last longer than they had previously. And speaking of food production, right, sterilization, the preservation of food was greatly improved as a result of industrialization. All of these things, again, kind of happening together in the same era. Maybe not exactly at the same time, but happening at overlapping periods while the country is going through this industrialization. Hey, these are just a few industries. There were many others. I should also mention, besides railroads with transportation, canals, steamboats were a major cause and facilitator of industrialization. Okay. Anyways, that's the answer to that question there. Let's go to the next one. What 3 industrial regions in modern times account for almost a quarter of all output? Okay, you can kind of almost get this one by looking at the next question. So Europe is responsible for 25%, for about 1/4 of all industrial production. North America, right, led by the United States, responsible for about 1/4, for about 25%. East Asia, responsible for about 25%, for about 1/4. If you do the math there, you can pretty much easily figure out that means about 25% or one fourth is coming from the rest of the world combined. Now, that last group, that number's growing a lot. And the first two groups there are definitely decreasing some. Western and Eastern Europe and North America, they're losing some of that industrial production, and the other areas of the world are gaining them. Okay, so those are the three traditional core areas, but just know there's a lot of change happening in modern times to those core areas. Next question. What are tradition? Oh, be able to identify some specific industrial areas in Western and Eastern Europe. Remember, there's like a dozen that are listed in the Rubenstein textbook. North America, remember, there's about 8 or 9, I think, 7 or 8. And East Asia. And remember, we have, I think, 4 or 5 of those in the book from that area. And have a general idea about what's produced there. Listen, you don't need to get bogged down in each of these industrial areas. It is incredibly unlikely they're going to ask any question specifically about an area without giving you enough information where you'll be able to figure it out. What you want to do with the areas is in Europe and then in North America, and then I think in Asia as well, you want to know what I would consider an older, more traditional region, right? So in Europe, that would be the area around the United Kingdom, right? Maybe some of those areas in northern and western France. And then you want to be familiar with a newer, right, region that maybe is in a newer or less traditional location. So the Po River or Catalan in Europe. All right, so that you can compare an older region with a newer one. It doesn't really matter which ones you specifically choose, as long as you can really focus in on a couple of them. So, like I said, maybe the United Kingdom, maybe one in Southern Europe, like the Po River, and then pick one in Russia or Eastern Europe that you really want to focus in on. Just kind of have an idea where that is, what they focus on, and just understand it's based on what resources are available in that area. And proximity, of course, to certain markets as well. You want to do that in North America as well. You want to pick a traditional area, just one, maybe one of the Great Lakes regions, right? And then you want to pick a less traditional industrial area, maybe the West Coast, California, and you want to focus in on maybe, I don't know, Chicago, right? And you want to focus in on the differences that exist between the two. How one is more traditional and older, and then a newer one that has emerged, right? That's usually based on different products, probably more modern consumer products. I hope that helps. If you have any questions on this, please let me know. I can go into further detail on that. East Asia, there's not a ton of industrial areas. You need to obviously know Japan, right? You need to know those industrial areas in China because they are just mass producers now. You need to be aware that South Korea is highly industrialized, and definitely should fall into that category as well. If there are any questions, let me know on that one. I hope that's enough. And go back to your homework assignment, right? You made maps for this. So go back and refer to this. You already have the information available. Like I said, pick a couple of regions in each area. Let's go to the next question. What are traditional situation factors that affect industry and why are they important? Okay, so we're getting into the Alfred Weber area here, right? We're getting into least cost theory. What are traditional situation factors? Well, what Weber talked about, remember, was that when an industry locates, it's going to pay attention to its proximity to its inputs. And remember, the inputs it's the resources needed to make it, right? So the products or ingredients, I guess we'll say, that you need to make it. They're also going to focus on the second factor, which is proximity to market, right? And that's all about how quickly they can get their product to sale, right? Whether that's, the city to be sold in stores, or whether it goes to another company that uses it to make their own product. So a company is going to measure, an industry is going to measure those two things. Its proximity to its inputs, right, versus the proximity to markets delivering its finished goods. And it's going to weigh the cost of those two things in determining where to locate. So that would be the situation, right? It would be determining the best spot to locate between those two areas, between where you get your products and between where you are delivering them for sale. And those would be the major situation factors. Now, he talked about a couple of other things as well. He talked about agglomeration, which I'll get down to at the bottom. He talked about perishability, which I'll get down to at the bottom as well. But that's the basics of least cost with Weber. All right, it's the proximity to inputs versus the proximity to markets to determine your transportation costs. Remember, transportation is the most important thing with Weber. He says that's the most important factor when determining where industries are located. I think I covered everything that I want with that one. So let's get to what are inputs and finished goods. Okay, so I kind of already answered this one too, right? Inputs I already mentioned are the resources that you need to make a product. Finished goods are what you produce that you from the resources, from the inputs that you then sell at market. I already kind of explained how they affect situation factors, right? According to Weber, what happens is a company is going to determine which of those steps, getting the inputs to the facility or getting the finished product to the market, is going to be more costly. How are they going to determine that? They're going to determine it based on which of those steps is going to weigh more in order to transport. Whichever one that is going to be more costly, and so they're going to locate their facility closer to that step, I guess you could say, closer to that part of the production process. So if it takes more weight and therefore more cost to get the inputs to the factory than it does to get the finished product to the market, the facility is going to locate closer to the factory. If it takes more weight and therefore more cost to get your finished product, right, what you're going to sell, your manufactured good, to the market than it did to get the inputs to your factory, you're going to locate closer to the market. Simple as that. So how do you determine this? Well, you determine whether your industry is more of a bulk gaining or a weight gaining industry, or whether it's more of a bulk or weight reducing industry. How do you do that? Well, like we just talked about, if you have a product where it's going to weigh more to get all of the inputs, all of the resources to make it, all of the, I guess, again, we'll call it ingredients to make it, to your factory, right, then you are a bulk reducing industry. Your product is going to lose weight or lose bulk over the production process. And so it's actually going to be lightest when you're transporting it to market. And that means it's going to be cheapest to carry at that time. Okay, examples of bulk reducing industry. Most metals are bulk reducing because you are taking large amounts of ore, right, out of the earth, for instance, when you're making iron or steel. And then you are converting them through these processes into much smaller pieces of shaped metal, shaped iron and shaped steel. So it takes a ton of inputs. It takes a lot of coal to fire up to get the necessary heat for that. It takes a lot of water as well to transport to cool it down. And then you end up with a relatively much smaller piece of iron or steel. And so that makes it a bulk reducing industry. All right. Any industry, lumber, right, or timber, paper is a good example of a bulk reducing industry, right? We're getting logs that are very, very heavy, that have been chopped down, trees that are being transported to the paper mills. And then you get a relatively small amount of paper in terms of weight out of that process. And so that makes it a bulk reducing process. That's why so many paper mills are always located very close to the forested areas. Okay, other bulk reducing industries, a lot of food products actually are, especially processed food products. Think about like wheat thins and the amount of wheat that has to be transported to those food processing facilities, right? Along with the other preservatives, along with the other products. And what do you get out of it? You get these small little wheat thins that are made out of a much larger amount of ingredient. Okay, so a lot of products are bulk reducing. I would say a lot more products are bulk reducing than the opposite. What do you do with bulk reducing industries? You locate them closer to where you get your resources. All right. So, you locate the iron mill and the steel mill generally closer to the iron ore pits, right? Um, Bulk gaining industries, that's the other end of the spectrum. All right, that's a product that's actually going to accumulate weight. All right, it's going to weigh more when you are transporting it to market than it did just getting the ingredients or the products there. Soft drinks and beer are really good examples of this. Why? Well, because the aluminum cans are actually transported empty, and they are filled at the last possible moment. And the reason for this is, well, empty aluminum cans are very, very, very light. And, ones that are filled with liquid are a lot heavier. And so it makes more sense for that industry to fill those cans at the very last minute so that it doesn't cost nearly as much to transport them to the market, since that's the most expensive step. So soft drinks are considered to be a bulk gaining industry, and that means they're going to locate much closer to the actual cities, to the markets, to reduce the length, right, that it takes to get those products during that heavier step. I think I've done a pretty good job of explaining that. By the way, auto manufacturers are considered that as well. They're considered bulk gaining. Why? Because the individual pieces or parts are produced and then shipped to the final assembly plant to be put together. That's usually right outside of the cities because that is often when the product is the heaviest, when it's all put together. Okay? Let's get to the steel. And by the way, every industry ought to be able to be labeled one more as bulk gaining or more bulk reducing. Of course, I know there are some industries that may have both steps during the process. We're looking at which step is more significant throughout the entire process in order to label it. Okay? How is the steel industry shown that in modern times proximity to markets is now more important than inputs? Ooh, good question. Okay. Well, what we have found with everything that we just said is it's less accurate than now than it has been in the past. So the steel industry is a great example of how traditionally industries would locate close to their inputs if they were bulk reducing. However, we know changes have happened in modern times. With modernization, with mechanization, we've seen massive changes to transportation and the times that it takes for us to get products to new places. We can also preserve products much better than we ever been able to before. And so as a result, transportation costs are now not nearly as important for industries as they used to be. They used to really be the primary factor in determining where industry is located. Now, in modern times, proximity to markets is oftentimes more important than inputs, and proximity to labor as well is more important than the inputs. And the reason for that is oftentimes you no longer need to be located as close to the resources, again, because transportation has increased and improved so much that the cost of transportation is significantly reduced. And so it oftentimes makes more sense to be located near labor sources. It oftentimes makes sense to want to get products into the markets as quickly as possible to allow for more efficiency, right? Less space taken up in your facilities and warehouses, and just more production as a whole. Okay, so now steel industries are starting to locate much further from their resources than ever before. We're actually seeing them located in some instances right overseas. China is massively picking up a lot of steel production, and it's actually still able to transport that steel, companies are, back to the United States and make it cost effective. What are three categories of industries that have traditionally located closer to markets? Okay, so we mentioned this already. First off, we have industries that use agglomeration. And agglomeration, remember, is when similar businesses will cluster together within an area. So that's one group that we tend to see locate closer to markets. And they usually do this a lot of times in modern times for labor reasons. If they need access to particular groups of laborers, they may locate in particular cities. We call these growth poles. And they tend to locate oftentimes in high tech or highly educated areas. These are usually like startups, electronic, internet companies. that are developing or growing in an area and are looking for particular, usually highly educated workers. So we're seeing a lot of growth bulls in the United States. And again, these tend to be industries that locate in a particular area, usually around major markets or major cities with large populations. That would be our first group. Agglomeration, right, tends to locate closer to markets than inputs. Okay? Number two would be perishable goods. Obviously, especially like news, right? When we're talking about industries and perishability, we're often talking about like information. And so news or other products that contain perishable info, they need to be located close to the market to get their product out regularly and to get it out quickly. Newspapers are a really, really great example of that. All right. Our third type of group, that industry that usually locates closer to the market, is called a single market manufacturer. This is a business that makes one product and one product only. And they make it for one, usually other company that uses it to put onto their product. So the best example of single market manufacturers, most automobile companies do not make a lot of the individual products on their cars, on their vehicles. Smaller factories do, right? They'll have a smaller factory that will make the headlights. They'll have another factory that'll make the driver's side door. They'll have another one that will make, for instance, the side view mirrors. And then each of those factories specializes in producing that. Well, they then all ship that product to the manufacturer, to Ford or to Chevy or to whomever, who assembles it at their assembly plant before it finally goes to market. Well, if you're a single market manufacturer, you need to be located close to the company, to the facility where your product is going. So that would make sense, right? Why, in that instance, the market is that other company, you need to be located close to the market. I hope that makes sense with each of those three different examples. Of course, they cluster around the city or the markets for different reasons. Okay, 4 modes of transportation, strengths and weaknesses. Well, we know the methods of transportation are truck, our rail, our ship, and our air. Let's not forget pipeline, but pipeline only allows for the transportation of resources. Let's keep that in mind. All right, so the whole thing with transportation, remember the costs have come way down. It's way more competitive than it used to be. The entire thing with transportation is the distance that you want to cover. All right, because generally speaking, the longer the distance, right, the slower the time it's going to take, and that means the lower the cost. There are 4 I should also mention the other factor is weight. All right, obviously, weight comes into play here when you're determining transportation as well. So we're going to start with truck, right? Truck is the primary short-range land transportation, and obviously, the beauty of truck is that you can usually get products there in just a few days. It's ideal for short, maybe a couple of days or, 2 to 3 day transport. It's very easy breaking that product down and getting it loaded and unloaded. That generally takes a small amount of labor to do so. Okay? It is, like I said, the ideal form for short to medium land transport. Rail is the next option. This is your ideal price-effective option for medium to long-range land transport, maybe upwards of a week or more, depending on where you are at. Rail is the most cost-effective option. It's also a great option for medium-sized freight. Obviously, it is considered moderate in terms of breaking bulk into and out of it. Faster, obviously, than shipping, but slower, obviously, than truck. Let's go to our third method, which is shipping. Shipping is ideal for the longer range transport, especially heavier loads. Obviously, if you need some sort of cross-continental that has to go across water, shipping is going to have to be a viable option. It's the most cost-effective, like I said, for longer trips, many weeks or months. And finally, we have air travel. Air travel is considered the most expensive. It is also the fastest by far. Usually, air transport only makes sense if you have kind of sensitive or very high priced goods where delivery is essential, right? Fast delivery is essential. Last question. Oh, and pipeline, obviously, mostly for oil, but other natural gas and resources as well, is a newer method that allows for resource movement, although not without controversy. Last thing, describe a situation where an industry might use multiple methods of delivery. Well, this is easy, right? If we're producing, for instance, in Asia, but we're selling our product in the United States, right, across the western half of the United States. Then once our product is produced, right, and it's shipped out from our Asian port, we're obviously going to have it on ship. Well, what we're going to need to do when we arrive at LA or wherever we're going to unload it, we're going to probably need to switch to a different method of delivery, most likely rail or truck. And so most industries, this is their situation, especially if they are producing goods overseas. What's a break of bulk point? So that's a fancy term to mean that's a place where you load or unload goods from one method of transportation onto another. So where you're able to take products from ships and put them onto trains or onto trucks. Every airport and every seaport in the world is a break of bulk point, right? Because that's specifically what they're there for. We have the cranes and other high-tech machinery. The idea is to, as quickly and efficiently as possible, load and unload products coming into and out of this country. They're known as entrepôts in Europe and around the rest of the world. Same exact thing, different term. Like I said, they're commonly located in seaports. They're commonly located in airports, where you could expect there to be a lot of intersectional traffic. All right, folks, the other half of this lecture is already provided to you. I'm going to link it here as well in the comments. Hopefully this was very helpful to you. Hopefully I didn't ramble on for too long. Thanks, folks. Take care.